3.5 miles below the surface of the Philippine Sea, in a pitch-black darkness so deep that light has never reached it, something is lying on the ocean floor. It's the wreckage of the USS Indianapolis. And when a deep-sea submersible finally reached it, what the cameras revealed was as shocking as a horse sprouting wings. Because what they had pictured in their minds was the complete opposite of what they found. The paint was still visible. You could read the hull number, 35, as clear as the day it was painted. Supply boxes still bore the ship's name in crisp stencil lettering. The word Norfolk was still etched on the side of an anchor. Even the blue and white star on a torn airplane wing was still intact, as if it had just fallen into the sea moments ago. But the most chilling thing the cameras captured wasn't what remained of the ship. It was something far more mind-blowing than that. Because on July 30th, 1945, 1,195 men boarded this vessel. 12 minutes later, it was gone. And what followed over the next 4 days and 5 nights was the single worst disaster in the history of the United States Navy, and perhaps the most terrifying ordeal any group of humans has ever endured at sea, because they were stranded in a place where they couldn't even hope that anyone would find their dead bodies, let alone rescue them alive. I'm David, and you're watching the David Donaldson channel. Join me as we descend into one of the most haunting chapters in naval history. We'll uncover the top-secret mission that sealed this ship's fate, endure the agony alongside those left floating in the Pacific Ocean, confront the greatest shark attack in recorded history, and finally, journey 3.5 miles down to the ocean floor to see what remains of a ship the world had forgotten. To understand why the Indianapolis sank, you first have to understand what she was doing out there in the first place. And this is where the story becomes extraordinary. In July 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its peak. The Allied forces were closing in on mainland Japan, and the losses on both sides were staggering. But behind the scenes, a weapon was being prepared that would change the course of human history forever. The Manhattan Project, the United States' top-secret nuclear weapons program, had successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. It was called the Trinity Test, and it had worked. Now, the components needed to build the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima had to be delivered to the Pacific island of Tinian as fast as possible. And that's why the USS Indianapolis was chosen. It's important to appreciate the irony here. The Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, launched in 1931, and she was no stranger to war. She had served as the flagship of the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance. She had fought in the battles of the Philippine Sea, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where a Japanese kamikaze had punched a bomb clean through her steel decks, nearly ending her story right there. She was repaired, patched up, and sent straight back to duty. But now, fresh out of an overhaul at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, she was given a new mission. One so secret that even her captain, Charles Butler McVeigh III, wasn't given the full details. On July 15, 1945, U.S. Army trucks pulled up alongside the ship at Hunters Point, San Francisco. A large wooden crate was loaded into the port hangar. A metal canister, containing 38.5 kilograms of enriched uranium-235 in the form of small discs, was welded into the absent Admiral Spruance's staff quarters. 2 men from the Manhattan Project, Major Robert Furman and Dr. James Nolan, accompanied the cargo undercover, disguised as artillery officers. Nolan's real job was to monitor the radioactivity of the uranium. The cover story for his frequent trips to the container was that he was simply seasick. None of the crew knew what they were carrying, but they knew it was something critically important. There were more admirals and high-ranking officials on the pier than anyone had ever seen. One sailor later recalled the moment, saying it felt like every general in the Pacific had shown up to see them off. The Indianapolis departed on July 16th and shattered the speed record from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, covering the distance in just 74.5 hours, at an average speed of 29 knots. She didn't stop. She raced unescorted to Tinian, arriving on July 26th and delivering her cargo. That cargo would become Little Boy, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. In fact, one of the ground crew members who loaded the bomb onto the Enola Gay inscribed a message on it. "Greetings to the Emperor from the men of the Indianapolis." They would never know how bitterly ironic that greeting would become. Her top-secret mission complete, the Indianapolis was ordered to proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training duty before rejoining the fleet. She departed Guam on July 28th, heading west across the Philippine Sea. She was unescorted, she had no underwater detection equipment, and most critically, Captain McVeigh had not been warned that a Japanese submarine, the I-58, was operating directly in the ship's path. The Navy knew the submarine was there. They just didn't tell him. Why? That question would haunt the survivors and their families for the next 55 years. At 14 minutes past midnight on the 30th of July, 1945, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy was peering through his periscope when he spotted a dark shape on the horizon. He gave the order. 6 torpedoes were released at 2-second intervals. 2 found their mark. The first struck the starboard bow, detonating in the forward magazine and triggering a catastrophic explosion that blew the entire front section of the ship clean off. The second hit amidships, near the fuel tanks, splitting open a pillar of flame that engulfed the cruiser. The ship began to list almost immediately. Power was lost. Communication systems were destroyed. The damage was so severe and so fast that no confirmed distress signal ever made it out. Within minutes, the bow was underwater. The stern was rising into the air. Captain McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship. Men scrambled in the darkness, many still half asleep, climbing over railings, walking down the side of the hull as it rolled, stepping into the black, oil-covered water of the Philippine Sea in the dead of night. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the USS Indianapolis was gone. Around 300 men went down with her. The remaining 890 or so found themselves floating in the open ocean, scattered across miles, covered in thick bunker oil, many grievously injured and with almost nothing to survive on. A handful of life rafts, a few life jackets, virtually no food or clean water, and no one in the world knew they were there. What happened next over the course of 4 days and 5 nights is, without exaggeration, one of the most harrowing survival stories ever recorded. As dawn broke on the first day, the survivors began to take stock of their situation. Many were burned. Many were bleeding. The bunker oil that coated everything stung their eyes and made it nearly impossible to see. Some had managed to grab life jackets. Others clung to whatever debris they could find. They formed into scattered groups, some as large as 300, others just a handful of men drifting together in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. There was no shelter from the blazing tropical sun during the day, which brought severe dehydration. At night, temperatures plummeted, and hypothermia set in. Saltwater sores ate into their skin. Men who drank the seawater, desperate with thirst, suffered hallucinations, delirium, and death. And then the sharks came. Drawn initially by the noise of the explosions and the scent of blood in the water, hundreds of sharks began to circle the survivors. The species most commonly identified by experts are the oceanic white-tip, one of the most aggressive sharks in the open ocean, and the tiger shark. They started with the dead. The bodies of those who had succumbed to injuries, exposure, or who had simply given up were dragged beneath the surface. But it didn't stop there. As the hours turned into days, the sharks grew bolder. They began attacking the living. Survivor Lowell Dean Cox described the attacks to the BBC years later, saying that a shark would come straight up like lightning, take a sailor, and drag him straight down. One came up and took the man right next to him. There was just screaming, yelling, and then nothing. Survivor Harold Bray, now 98 years old and the last living member of the crew, recalled looking down into the water and seeing dozens of sharks just swarming below. Their tails would hit him. There was nowhere to go. The men in larger groups fared slightly better. They kicked, punched, and beat the sharks away. But those on the edges, the injured, and those drifting alone were the most vulnerable. In one horrifying account, survivor Eugene Morgan described a cargo net with around 15 sailors on it being hit by 10 sharks simultaneously. Afterwards, there was nothing left. Even the act of eating could be deadly. One group of survivors managed to salvage a can of Spam from floating debris. The moment they opened it, the scent drew a swarm of sharks so close that the men threw the food away rather than risk another attack. Estimates vary, but somewhere between a few dozen and 150 men are believed to have been killed by sharks during those 4 days. It remains the deadliest mass shark attack in recorded history. But the sharks were only part of the nightmare. More men died from dehydration, exposure, salt poisoning, drowning, and sheer despair. Some, delirious from drinking seawater, attacked their own shipmates. Others simply gave up. As Harlan Twible, a young ensign who took command of a group of 325 survivors, later put it, "You have to fight to live. All you have to do to die is just give up." And he saw many young men do exactly that. Now, here's the part of this story that should make your blood boil. Because the Indianapolis wasn't reported missing. Due to a catastrophic chain of communication failures and misunderstood directives within the Navy, when the ship failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf on the 31st of July, nobody raised the alarm. She simply vanished from the map. 3 separate Navy stations actually picked up fragments of a distress signal that night. One commanding officer was reportedly drunk. Another had ordered his men not to disturb him. The third dismissed it as a Japanese trap designed to lure rescue ships into an ambush. None of them acted. And so, for 4 days and 5 nights, nearly 900 men floated in shark-infested waters in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and nobody came. The rescue, when it finally came, was pure chance. On the 2nd of August, Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn was flying a routine patrol in a PV-1 Ventura when he spotted an oil slick on the surface while adjusting his antenna. Descending to 300 feet to investigate what he assumed was an enemy submarine, he saw the last thing he expected. Oil-covered men, waving, splashing, slapping the water. Hundreds of them. He radioed for help. Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived in a PBY Catalina flying boat and dropped survival supplies. But when he saw sharks actively attacking survivors in the water below, he disobeyed direct orders and landed his aircraft in the open sea to pull men to safety. He lashed survivors to the wings of his plane with parachute cord, rendering the aircraft unflyable. His plane eventually rescued 56 men before it was deliberately sunk. After nightfall, the destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived and used its searchlight as a beacon to guide the remaining survivors toward rescue. Over the following hours, 7 ships pulled the last men from the water. Of the roughly 890 who had survived the sinking, only 316 were still alive. 879 men were gone. No U.S. warship sunk at sea has ever lost more sailors. But the tragedy of the Indianapolis didn't end with the rescue. In fact, for Captain Charles McVeigh, the nightmare was only just beginning. In what many historians and survivors alike have called one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in military history, McVeigh was court-martialed for the loss of his ship. He was the only captain in the entire history of the United States Navy to be convicted for losing a ship sunk by an act of war. The charge? Failing to zigzag. A defensive sailing maneuver designed to make it harder for submarines to target a ship. Here's what makes this particularly outrageous. The Navy had known about the Japanese submarine I-58 operating in the area, but had not warned McVeigh. He had requested but been denied a protective escort. The intelligence that could have saved his ship was classified and withheld from the court itself. And perhaps most damningly of all, the prosecution flew Commander Hashimoto, the very man who had sunk the Indianapolis, from Japan to Washington to testify against McVeigh. Hashimoto told the court that zigzagging would have made absolutely no difference. He would have sunk the ship regardless. It didn't matter. McVeigh was convicted. Although he was later restored to active duty and eventually retired as a rear admiral, the guilt placed upon his shoulders was relentless. Families of lost crewmen sent him hate mail for decades. One Christmas card read, "Merry Christmas. Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son." On the 6th of November, 1968, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III walked onto the front lawn of his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, holding a toy sailor in one hand, and he took his own life. He was 70 years old. The surviving crew never stopped fighting for their captain. Their campaign was eventually joined by an unlikely ally, a 12-year-old student from Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott. After watching the Indianapolis monologue in the film Jaws for a school history project, Hunter interviewed nearly 150 survivors and poured through 800 official documents, ultimately building a case so compelling it was presented to the United States Congress. In October 2000, 32 years after McVeigh's death, President Bill Clinton signed a congressional resolution exonerating Charles McVeigh for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. Commander Hashimoto, the man who sank the ship, had also written to the U.S. Senate in support of McVeigh's innocence. He died just 5 days before the exoneration was signed. For 72 years after that terrible night in 1945, the wreck of the USS Indianapolis eluded every attempt to find it. The coordinates of the sinking were imprecise. The ship lay somewhere in a vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, and the ocean floor here isn't flat. It's a rugged underwater mountain range, with peaks, ridges, and valleys plunging to enormous depths. Looking for a ship down there was like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a continent. But in 2017, the search took a decisive turn. Richard Hulver, a historian at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, made a breakthrough. He located a previously overlooked log entry from an amphibious landing ship, the LST-779, which had crossed paths with the Indianapolis just 11 hours before the torpedoes struck. This crucial piece of evidence narrowed the search area significantly, placing the ship roughly 25 miles west of the previously reported sinking position. Armed with this information, an expedition led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and his research vessel, the Petrel, set out into the Philippine Sea. The Petrel carried state-of-the-art subsea technology, including remotely operated vehicles capable of diving to 3.5 miles. On the 19th of August, 2017, 18,000 feet below the surface, they found her. And what the cameras revealed was nothing short of extraordinary. The main body of the wreck lies in an enormous impact crater on the ocean floor, resting partially on its port side, partially buried in sediment, on the slopes of an underwater mountain. The bow, which had been blown off by the first torpedo, was found 1.5 miles to the east, marking the violent separation that occurred as the ship sank. The two forward 8-inch gun turrets, which also broke away on the surface, lie 0.5 mile east of the main wreck, marking the ship's final position on the surface before she went under. Now, here's what stunned researchers the most. The wreck is remarkably well preserved. At 18,000 feet, the conditions are extraordinary. There is virtually no natural light. Oxygen levels are extremely low. Currents are minimal. The water temperature hovers just above freezing. In this environment, corrosion is drastically slowed. The paint on the hull was still clearly visible. The hull number, 35, was unmistakable. Supply boxes still bore stenciled text you could read with the naked eye. The anchor still carried the name of the shipyard where it was forged. Robert Nayland, head of the Underwater Archaeology Branch at the Naval History and Heritage Command, described the preservation as the most surprising aspect of the discovery. Even aluminum-eating bacteria, whose waste creates strange formations called rusticles, were found draping from hatches and gun turrets, giving the wreck an eerie, almost organic appearance, as if the ocean itself was slowly reclaiming the ship, wrapping it in something between decay and memorial. The starboard hangar bay was visible. A torn seaplane wing, its blue and white American star still intact, lay on a nearby debris field. Victory markings, including silhouettes of Japanese rising sun flags tallying enemy kills, were still visible on pieces of wreckage. But perhaps the most powerful image captured by the submersible cameras was the simplest. The ship's guns still pointed outward, encrusted in coral, still on watch after more than 7 decades in the dark, as if the Indianapolis was still guarding something, still waiting. The expedition did not enter the wreck. No artifacts were collected. Nothing was disturbed, because the USS Indianapolis isn't just a shipwreck, it's a grave. The final resting place of nearly 300 men who went down with the ship, and a memorial to the nearly 600 more who never made it out of the water. Under the Sunken Military Craft Act, the wreck is protected by law. Its exact coordinates have never been publicly released. The extreme depth and hostile terrain make unauthorized visits virtually impossible, and that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. As of 2026, Harold Bray, now 98 years old, remains the last living survivor of the USS Indianapolis. A man who was just 17 years old when he stepped off a sinking warship into shark-infested darkness. Under the Sunken Military Craft Act, the wreck is protected by law. Its exact coordinates have never been publicly released. The extreme depth and hostile terrain make unauthorized visits virtually impossible, and that, perhaps, is exactly as it should be. As of 2026, Harold Bray, now 98 years old, remains the last living survivor of the USS Indianapolis. A man who was just 17 years old when he stepped off a sinking warship into shark-infested darkness. He went on to serve as a police officer in the small town of Benicia, California, for 3 decades. A bronze statue of him now stands in the town, showing him as a teenager in his Navy uniform, a sparkle in his eye, as if to say everything's going to be okay. He still thinks about his shipmates every single day. He once said, "Why was I so lucky? I think about it every day, contemplating what could have been." When asked about the sharks, about the water, about the 4 days that took nearly 900 of his friends, he paused and said simply, "So many friends. Gone." In 2023, Harold wrote a letter to the last surviving crew member of the Japanese submarine Y-58, a man named Kunshiro Kiyozumi, who was just 16 years old when the torpedoes were fired. In it, Harold wrote, "I want to extend my hand in friendship to you, and to tell you that I bear no ill will towards you or your fellow countrymen. We both fought for our countries, and now that the war is over, this is a time for healing. There are no winners in a war. Both sides lose so much." The USS Indianapolis carried the weapon that ended one war, and in doing so, it became the stage for one of the most devastating human tragedies in modern history. A tragedy compounded by secrecy, by negligence, by an unjust court-martial, and by 72 years of silence on the ocean floor. Now the ship has been found, but the questions haven't stopped. What else lies in the debris fields surrounding the wreck? As deep-sea technology continues to advance, will future expeditions reveal more about the ship's final moments? And as the last living connection to that terrible night in 1945 grows older, who will carry the torch of remembrance when he's gone? Some stories deserve to be told again and again. Not because they're comfortable, but because the men who lived and died in them deserve to never be forgotten. And the USS Indianapolis, resting silently 3.5 miles beneath the waves, still on watch, still guarding the memory of 879 souls, is one of those stories. If you got this far in the video, leave us an anchor in the comments and let us know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.